Linda Harper stood on the edge of her daughter's driveway, her soft beige cardigan pulled close against the wind. The suitcase beside her felt heavier than it should have, not because of the contents, but because of everything it symbolized. Every small surrender made in the name of convenience, grief, or love. Rebecca emerged from the house with a bright, too-practiced smile and waved, calling, "Sweetheart, you made it!" as if Linda were arriving for a casual lunch instead of starting over. Inside, the house smelled of lemon cleaner and rosemary diffuser oil. Everything was sleek and intentional. No clutter, no softness, not like the warm chaos of Linda's own home before her husband passed. Rebecca gave her the grand tour in a tone that was both proud and faintly performative, pointing out the guest room, the gym she and Matt barely had time to use, and the spot where Linda's favorite chair would go if it fit the aesthetic. Linda nodded politely, clutching her purse a little tighter. She was grateful, truly. After all, Rebecca hadn't hesitated when Linda admitted she couldn't keep up the house or the bills alone anymore. But already a quiet current of unease was settling beneath the gratitude, a sense that somehow she was shrinking in this place. By the end of the first week, Rebecca had taken over Linda's mail and banking, just to streamline things. She sat at the kitchen island each morning with her laptop open, asking Linda for passwords like she was asking for a tea bag. "Don't stress about this stuff, sweetheart. You've done enough in your life," she'd say, patting Linda's hand. Linda smiled thinly, reminding herself that this was her daughter, that she was only trying to help. Matt was more casual, more slippery. He never said no outright, just laughed things off. When Linda mentioned she might want to drive herself to the store, he leaned back on the couch and chuckled. "No offense, but it's just easier if we handle it. You've earned a break, right?" It was always phrased as a kindness, always framed as care. Linda, used to people taking her words seriously, felt herself slowly fading into the background. One morning, a glossy envelope arrived, addressed to her. Linda opened it at the dining table while Rebecca made a smoothie. The letter inside confirmed her lease on a luxury SUV. Her brow furrowed. She hadn't leased anything. "Becky," she asked softly, "what is this about a car?" Rebecca didn't even turn around, just said, "Oh, Matt put it under your credit. It's just easier this way. You're not really using it, right?" Linda's breath caught. She stared at the paper in her hand while the blender roared behind her, drowning out her thoughts. When she managed to respond, her voice was tight but calm. "You should have asked me." Rebecca finally turned, smiling gently. "You're overreacting. It's all taken care of. At your age, you really shouldn't stress about these things." Linda nodded slowly, folding the paper back into the envelope. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. But that night, after everyone had gone to bed, she pulled out her old address book and flipped through its worn pages until she found the number for David Tran, her former bank manager. As the phone rang in the quiet darkness, Linda realized this wasn't just about a car. It was about the slow theft of her agency, papered over with good intentions. When David picked up, she said quietly, "I need to talk to someone I can trust." David Tran hadn't heard from Linda in years, but his voice warmed with immediate recognition. Over the phone, Linda explained the situation carefully, not with outrage, but with the measured tone of someone who had spent a lifetime being composed. David listened without interrupting, his silence respectful. And when she finished, he said gently, "Let's come in next week. We'll go over everything. Together." The next few days passed slowly. Linda resumed her quiet role in the house. She made tea in the mornings, folded laundry neatly, nodded along to Rebecca's monologues about work deadlines and parent-teacher meetings. On the outside, nothing had changed. She smiled when spoken to, thanked Matt when he brought home dinner, and played the part of the grateful mother, all the while mentally cataloging passwords, account numbers, and strange charges on bank statements that Rebecca handled. When she visited the bank, David was waiting in a crisp shirt and with a folder already prepared. He went through her accounts patiently, explaining where credit had been extended, where it had been spent. Together they identified the SUV, a credit card for a high-end fitness center, and a line of credit being used for house renovations Linda hadn't authorized. "We can freeze your credit," he said with us. "We'll flag the accounts. We can start the fraud process, but are you safe at home?" Linda smiled gently and replied, "They're not dangerous, just entitled." Back at the house, Linda said nothing. She moved through the rooms like a shadow, quiet and observant. At night, she reviewed her notes, double-checked files, and backed up documents in a new email account. She contacted the local legal aid office and scheduled an appointment with a young woman named Emilia, who listened the way David had, with patience, without judgment. Emilia helped her draft a formal fraud report and offered resources for senior financial abuse. Linda took everything in, carefully, like laying bricks for a foundation only she could see. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Matt joked about all the paperwork they had to do to keep things running smoothly. "Good thing you're retired, huh?" he said, grinning, fork halfway to his mouth. Linda smiled back, her eyes steady, and replied, "Yes, good thing." Neither Rebecca nor Matt noticed the difference in her tone, but Linda felt it, something shifting, subtle, but permanent. She stopped using the joint card. She ordered groceries through a separate account. She made a list of what she would need if she left, just the essentials: medication, clothes, documents, a few photos. Nothing heavy, nothing that would slow her down. She waited, patient as the days stretched thin around her, and watched as the people who loved her convenience more than her company started revealing the full scope of their indifference. And then, on a Thursday morning soaked in pale sun, a white tow truck pulled into the driveway. Linda was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, the envelope of documents, in her lap. The driver stepped out, tall, calm, efficient. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Linda nodded once. He nodded back. The transaction, like her transformation, required no explanation. The sound of the repo truck's hydraulic lift was soft, but undeniable. Matt burst out of the house, barefoot, shouting before he'd even seen the driver. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, eyes darting from the truck to Linda, who remained seated, calm, her tea cooling beside her. The driver, Doug, said nothing beyond a simple, "Vehicle's registered under Linda Harper. Paperwork's clean." Rebecca followed, her voice shrill as she called out, "Mom, what is this? What did you do?" But Linda didn't look up right away. She watched the sunlight catch the windshield of the SUV as it tilted upward, the car that symbolized her erasure, now being gently removed from her narrative. Finally, she turned and said, "You'll want to move your gym bag. They're taking it now." Matt's protest fizzled into an indignant scoff. He tried to reason with Doug, tried to charm him with his usual half-smile and easy tone, but Doug had seen this before. He simply handed Matt a release notice and went back to securing the straps. Rebecca walked closer, her tone switching from anger to concern. "Sweetheart, are you okay? You're clearly confused. Let's go inside and talk." "No," Linda said, folding her documents slowly and tucking them back into her purse. The single word was not loud, but it was immovable. "I've spoken to legal aid. I've closed the joint accounts. And I've placed a fraud alert on my credit. You'll be hearing from someone soon." Her voice remained soft, but every syllable carried weight, and for the first time, Rebecca looked unsure. The house, which had once felt so sterile and controlled, now echoed with discomfort. Linda stood and picked up her overnight bag. A plain canvas thing, light, but full of everything important. She didn't look rushed. She had been preparing for this moment far longer than anyone realized. A cab pulled into the driveway, idling quietly behind the tow truck, its arrival perfectly timed. Rebecca's voice broke as she stepped forward. "Where will you go? You don't have to do this. We were just trying to make things easier for you." Linda shook her head, her silver hair catching the light. "You were making things easier for yourselves. You stopped seeing me as a person and started treating me like a resource." Matt crossed his arms, leaning against the porch rail, that familiar smirk trying to reassert control. "Come on, let's not make this a big deal." Linda paused at the car door and looked back one last time. It was already a big deal. You just didn't care when it was only happening to me. As the cab pulled away, Doug watched in the rearview mirror, the SUV secure on the back of his truck. He'd seen many recoveries in his line of work, but rarely one that felt like justice. Linda sat in the back seat, spine straight, eyes forward, not triumphant, just free. And in that freedom, there was peace. The cab ride was quiet, save for the occasional soft buzz of the meter. Linda didn't look out the window much. She wasn't interested in the landscape sliding by. Her thoughts moved inward, organizing themselves like unpacked suitcases. She had always believed that freedom arrived with fanfare or declarations, but here it was in silence, in the soft click of her new apartment keys tucked into her coat pocket. The place she'd leased wasn't large or luxurious, but it was hers. A one-bedroom with pale walls and a balcony just wide enough for a chair and a small, potted plant. The leasing agent, a cheerful young man named Evan, had greeted her with more respect in 10 minutes than she'd received from her family in the past year. When he asked if she'd like to set up auto-pay or get a paper invoice each month, Linda smiled and said, "Paper, please." She wanted a trail, a record, something tangible. This time she would leave footprints. Moving in took no time. Her overnight bag held the essentials: a week's worth of clothes, her medication, a framed photo of her wedding day, and a slim folder filled with every critical document she'd gathered. Amelia from Legal Aid had offered to help her review next steps, possibly pressing charges, possibly restitution. But Linda wasn't in a rush. She needed to reclaim her time first, in small doses. The first night alone was startling in its quiet. She sat on the edge of her bed, the sheets crisp and unfamiliar, and listened to the absence of voices. No Matt chuckling at his own jokes, no Rebecca's clipped instructions disguised as concern, just the hum of the refrigerator and the soft shuffle of wind through the balcony door. It was a strange sort of peace, tinged with both grief and relief, like finally taking off a tight pair of shoes. In the morning, Linda made her own coffee the way she liked it, strong and black, and sipped it on the balcony, wrapped in a fleece blanket. She watched the street below, people hurrying to jobs or walking dogs, and for once didn't feel invisible. She called Amelia to thank her, and then spent the afternoon filing an identity theft affidavit. Later, she found a second-hand bookstore nearby and bought a novel, something she hadn't done in ages. Each small act felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. By the end of the week, she'd opened her own checking account, signed up for a Tai Chi class at the community center, and learned the names of 2 neighbors. She wasn't looking to rebuild everything she had lost, not yet. But she was building something new, something entirely her own. When Evan from the leasing office passed her one evening and asked if she was settling in all right, Linda smiled with a steadiness that came from deep inside and replied, "Yes, I think I finally am." There were still bruises on her spirit, tender places where betrayal had touched her, but now she was tending to them, gently and without apology. She had been underestimated, dismissed, even used, but she was no one's fool. Not anymore. Linda sat at the small desk by the window, pen in hand, a legal pad stretched open like a page in her life waiting to be written. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted soft amber streaks across the buildings, but inside she hovered between memory and resolve. She had no intention of sending the letter she was writing, not yet, maybe never, but the act of writing was for her, a way to clear the emotional static still clinging to her mind. "Dear Rebecca," she began, pausing after the words. They looked odd on the page, too formal, too distant. But then again, maybe that distance was honest. She continued, "I'm not writing to hurt you. I'm writing because I need to understand how we got here. Or maybe I already do, and I just need to put it in words." Her handwriting was slow, deliberate, the way her speech had become in recent years. Quiet, but intentional. She didn't accuse, not in the way people think of accusations. She simply described what happened. The trust handed over without hesitation. The small dismissals that multiplied until they formed a cage. She wrote about the day the car bill arrived, about how being told she was too old to worry about things had hurt more than if they'd just said, "We don't care what you think." Linda paused again, let the silence settle, then wrote, "It wasn't just the fraud. It was the erasure." She stopped halfway through the second page. The room had grown dimmer, but she didn't bother with the light. Some truths are best written in twilight. She folded the paper carefully, slid it into a drawer, and returned to the present. The sound of someone walking their dog outside, the hum of distant traffic, the smell of lentil soup warming on the stove. The letter had served its purpose. It had made space in her mind. Later that week, Amelia called to check in. "Any more contact from them?" she asked. "No," Linda replied, "and I think that's a good thing." There was no satisfaction in saying it, only clarity. Amelia offered updates about the fraud report and possible restitution channels, but Linda waved them off for now. "I'm okay. I just want to breathe." She found small rituals to anchor her days, watering a basil plant on the windowsill, writing grocery lists by hand, choosing a different cafe each Friday just to sit and watch the world. Her phone stayed mostly silent, and for the first time it didn't feel like a loss. There were no guilt-laced check-ins, no manipulative reassurances, just peace. One evening, she attended her first community book club meeting. When she introduced herself, she said only, "I'm Linda. I just moved here." And that was enough. No need to explain what she had escaped, no need to defend her choices. By the time the meeting ended, someone had invited her to lunch next week. She accepted, smiling with a gentle confidence. As she walked home, Linda realized she hadn't thought about the SUV once all day. She hadn't thought about being old or irrelevant or burdensome. She'd just been herself. And that was more than enough. Weeks passed, marked not by big events but by the rhythm of Linda's new life. Library visits, early morning walks, conversations with neighbors that grew steadily more familiar. Her apartment, once a blank space of transition, now carried her presence in small, intentional ways. A worn quilt on the armchair, a ceramic mug from her anniversary trip, the faint scent of lavender from the sachets she always kept in drawers. There was a serenity in this simplicity, a sense that she had finally stepped into her own outline again. One afternoon, as she sorted through mail, she found an envelope without a return address. Inside was a card with Rebecca's handwriting, stiff, careful, and unmistakably strained. "Hope you're well. Let's talk sometime?" it read. Linda studied the words for a long moment, then set the card on the table. There was no anger in her, not anymore. Just a distant ache, like pressing on a bruise that's almost healed. She didn't feel the need to respond, Not yet. Maybe never. Some doors don't have to be slammed shut, but they don't have to be reopened either. Instead, she focused on her own growth. At Tai Chi class, she now moved with more confidence, the motions fluid, no longer second-guessed. The instructor, a wiry woman in her 70s, often said, "Stability starts from the feet." Linda repeated it to herself sometimes, letting the truth of it sink in. It wasn't just about posture, it was about having a place to stand without apology. On Sundays, she visited the community garden, where she was slowly learning the names of plants and people alike. She planted marigolds for her late husband, their bold gold petals reminding her of the brightness he used to bring into every room. Other volunteers asked about her story, but Linda gave only what she wanted to: a nod to a daughter, a mention of downsizing, never the full map of what had brought her here. That story, she had come to understand, belonged to her alone. A local nonprofit reached out asking if she'd consider speaking to a small group of women about financial boundaries and elder rights. Linda hesitated at first. Her instinct had always been to stay quiet, to avoid making waves. But then she remembered how many women never even realized they had a voice until it was too late. So she agreed. Her talk was short and simple. She didn't name names, didn't need to. She just said, "If someone insists they're doing you a favor, but you feel smaller every time they do it, that's not love. That's control." Afterward, a woman lingered to say thank you. Another handed her a card with a phone number, just in case you ever need to talk. Linda tucked it into her purse, surprised by the comfort in being seen. That night, she sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching dusk settle into the buildings around her. The city hummed softly below, and for once, she didn't feel outside of it. She felt rooted, steady, and for the first time in a long time, whole. Winter crept in slowly, softening the edges of the city with fog and early dusk. Linda found herself waking earlier, drawn to the stillness before sunrise when the world felt suspended in breath. Her mornings began with the rustle of her slippers across the floor and the quiet gurgle of the kettle, followed by moments on the balcony wrapped in a wool shawl, hands curled around her favorite mug. She didn't mind the cold. It made the tea taste better and the quiet feel deeper. Inside, she added small touches to her apartment: a framed print of a watercolor coastline, a wind chime that caught the light more than the breeze, and a small wooden bird her husband had carved in the 70s. Each item was a declaration. I live here, and this is mine. She wasn't trying to recreate the past. She was rooting herself in the present, item by item, memory by memory. Every day, she practiced this quiet ownership. Letters from Rebecca came once a month now. They were longer than the first, filled with vague sentiments and tepid apologies. I didn't realize how things looked, one read. We were trying our best, said another. Linda read them all, placed them in a box she kept at the back of her closet, and moved on. Forgiveness, she had come to believe, was not always a reunion. Sometimes it was a release, a decision to stop waiting for others to understand what they never cared to see. Amelia called again, this time with news that the fraud case had reached the final stage. They'll be contacting you to confirm restitution, she explained, her tone gentle but professional. Linda nodded, thanked her, and hung up. The word restitution echoed in her mind, oddly clinical for what she had endured. No check would restore the lost trust, the chipped dignity, or the hollow loneliness of being treated like a burden. But that was all right. Linda didn't want compensation. She wanted closure, and she'd already found it. At the community center, a younger woman named Carla had started joining Linda on her walks after Tai Chi. Carla was recovering from a divorce, and though her story was different, the themes were familiar: dismissal, invisibility, the slow erosion of self-worth under the mask of kindness. They walked in comfortable silence most days, only exchanging soft insights or shared glances of understanding. Linda found a strange comfort in those walks. They were not about fixing anything, but about being witnessed. One evening, as she closed the curtains against the sharp chill outside, Linda caught her reflection in the glass. She didn't look older or younger, just more present. Her eyes were clear, her shoulders relaxed, and there was something in her posture that hadn't been there before. A certainty. Not loud or boastful, just steady. She had come through a storm and didn't need to announce her survival. It was in every breath she took, every step she made, every quiet morning she now claimed as her own. The days began to stretch again, inching toward spring with a reluctant kind of hope. The light lingered a little longer on Linda's kitchen tiles, and crocuses pushed through the soil in the community garden, defiant and small. Linda paused by them each morning, watching their petals open like soft declarations that even buried things find their way back. It reminded her that growth didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it unfolded quietly, just beneath the surface. She found herself smiling more without realizing it, at strangers in the cafe line, at the librarian who always remembered her name, at her own reflection when brushing her hair. There was a kind of lightness returning to her, not the giddy kind of youth, but the steadiness of someone who no longer doubted her right to take up space. She began volunteering a few hours a week at the garden, helping organize tools and greet new members. One of them, a retired teacher named Janice, shared her love for birds and showed her how to track their migration patterns in a small, leather-bound notebook. Linda took to it easily, her eyes sharper now not just from age, but from observation. Rebecca called once. The phone rang in the late afternoon, her name flashing across the screen in familiar type. Linda let it ring the first time. Then she picked up, not with anger, but with caution. "Mom," Rebecca began, her voice hesitant, too measured. "I just wanted to check in. I know things got complicated." Linda listened. She said very little. When Rebecca asked if they could meet, Linda paused and then said, "Not yet. I'm still finding out what it feels like to be on my own." The silence that followed was long, but not hostile, just honest. After hanging up, Linda made tea and sat by the window. She didn't cry, she didn't second-guess herself. She simply let the moment be what it was, an acknowledgement that healing doesn't always involve reconnection. Sometimes it means holding your boundary with kindness and moving forward without bitterness. At the next book club, she shared a passage from a memoir she'd recently loved. The story was about a woman rebuilding her life after betrayal, and when Linda read the words aloud, she did so without shaking. Her voice, warm and calm, carried through the room. When she finished, there was a pause before the others clapped softly, nodding, a few eyes misty. It was not applause for performance. It was gratitude for truth. Linda had given them a piece of herself, not the wound, but the scar, smooth and healed. Later that evening, she walked home under a sky dotted with early stars. The wind was cool, but not harsh, brushing through her hair like a reminder that change had arrived, and she had welcomed it. Her keys jingled in her coat pocket. Her steps were even, unhurried. Inside her apartment, she lit a small candle and let its flicker fill the room. She wasn't looking back anymore. Whatever came next, she would meet it standing tall, steady, and fully her own. Spring settled fully into the city with blooming dogwoods and golden sunlight that spilled generously across sidewalks. Linda walked with a steadier rhythm now, her shoes worn in the right places, her shoulders lifted by something close to contentment. There was no dramatic transformation, no single moment that claimed triumph, but rather a slow gathering of confidence, stitched together from quiet victories and deliberate choices. She attended a local workshop one weekend on digital literacy for seniors, not because she needed the help, but because she liked the idea of staying sharp. The instructor, a college student named Marco, was kind and engaging, and when he explained how to use financial tracking apps, Linda caught herself grinning. She downloaded one later that evening, not because she had to, but because she could. These small acts had become her way of reclaiming the parts of her life that had once been handed over too easily. In the afternoons, she often sat by the window with a journal, writing down thoughts, not as confessions but as reflections. She no longer wrote letters she didn't intend to send. Those had served their purpose. Now she wrote to herself to acknowledge growth, to document clarity, to remember how far she had come without needing anyone else to validate it. One entry read simply, "Freedom doesn't shout. It hums beneath your skin when no one is watching." Carla, her walking companion from Tai Chi, invited her to a potluck dinner one Saturday. Linda hesitated, unused to casual social invitations that came without obligation, but she accepted, showing up with her husband's old potato salad recipe and a bottle of sparkling cider. The apartment was full of laughter, mismatched chairs, and the comforting chaos of people being themselves. Linda found a spot on the couch and settled in easily, joining conversations without the invisible weight of performance or pretense. Someone asked her midway through the evening, "So what do you do?" The question wasn't loaded, but Linda felt its shape. She paused, then smiled and replied, "I live my life. I've earned the right to do just that." The woman across from her laughed and raised her glass. "Well, I'll drink to that." And they did, not with ceremony, but with warmth. Back at home, the apartment greeted her like a quiet friend. She changed into her nightclothes, turned on the radio, and moved gently through her evening routine. There were no urgent calls, no condescending voices, no sense of being monitored. Just the comforting consistency of her own design. As she crawled into bed and turned off the lamp, she realized she no longer felt displaced. She was not recovering anymore. She was living. The future still held unknowns, of course. Life never stopped offering surprises, some gentle, others sharp. But Linda no longer feared being caught unprepared. She had been underestimated, used, and nearly erased. And yet, here she was, whole, wise, and quietly powerful. Her freedom wasn't flashy, but it was firm, and that, she knew now, was enough. Summer's approach came not with heat, but with light. Long, golden afternoons and soft, lingering evenings. Linda began rising earlier, just to walk beneath the jacaranda trees before the sun burned too hot. There was something about the hush of morning, the way it wrapped around her like a shawl, that made everything feel more grounded. The world, even in its relentless pace, had granted her space to breathe. She had taken to reading on her balcony, choosing memoirs, essays, and poems, voices of women who had reclaimed their stories, stitched themselves back together after being unraveled by people they once trusted. These words didn't haunt her. They accompanied her. They reminded her that survival wasn't a line crossed once, but a path walked daily, with quiet strength and relentless self-compassion. She found herself underlining sentences, not to remember pain, but to honor wisdom. One morning, she received a message from Amelia. The legal aid case had officially closed. "You've been approved for partial financial restitution," the email read. Linda stared at the screen, then closed her laptop. She didn't feel triumphant. Instead, she felt a quiet finality, like the last page of a book she had outgrown. She didn't need the money to validate her experience. She had already reclaimed the most important thing, her voice. That afternoon, she took out the box of Rebecca's letters from the closet. She read the first one again, then the second, the third. They were apologetic in tone, but empty in accountability. There were no acknowledgments of harm, only vague regrets and justifications. Linda set the stack aside and wrote one final letter, not out of hope, not for reconciliation, but for herself. "I loved you enough to trust you," she wrote. "You loved me just enough to use that trust. I am not angry anymore, but I am not yours to manage. I choose peace, not silence." She didn't sign it. She folded it neatly and slipped it between the pages of her journal. That evening she walked to the nearest overlook, a quiet spot where the city spread below in soft pink hues, rooftops glowing as dusk crept in. Linda stood there for a while, watching the wind play through the trees, the world unfolding without urgency. A couple nearby laughed, a dog barked in the distance, and still she stood, steady and sure. This was her life now. Not a reaction, not a recovery, but a new chapter written entirely in her own hand. As night fell, she returned home, locking the door behind her with the ease of someone who belonged. She poured herself a glass of water, opened the windows, and let the breeze carry the day away. There were no ghosts here, no apologies waiting to be accepted. Only a woman in her own light, in her own space, fully awake. And though she had spoken many truths aloud, there was one final truth she kept for herself. Sometimes, the last word doesn't need to be spoken. Sometimes, it simply lived. By mid-July, the air was thick with the hum of cicadas and the scent of blooming jasmine that curled around street corners like an old song. Linda had grown used to the rhythm of the city in summer, its early morning stillness, its midday buzz, the calm hush that returned at twilight. She moved through her days with an easy steadiness, no longer measuring time in regrets or second-guessing her decisions. Each moment was its own quiet affirmation. She had chosen herself, and that choice was enough. She spent more time outdoors now, taking her journal to the park, sipping iced tea on benches under leafy canopies, nodding to the familiar faces of people she didn't yet know by name, but recognized by spirit. There was comfort in that shared anonymity, in being part of the gentle background of a neighborhood that asked for nothing more than her presence. She began attending local lectures at the senior center, not out of loneliness, but out of curiosity. The world, it seemed, still had so much to offer. Conversations to overhear, stories to absorb, details to savor. At one of these events, she met a man named Ernest, a former school principal with a thoughtful smile and the quiet kind of humor that bloomed slowly. They struck up an easy rapport, their conversations meandering from books to music to the strange, often bittersweet journey of aging. They didn't exchange numbers right away. There was no rush, no pretense. It was enough to look forward to seeing each other on Thursdays. It was enough to feel visible again, not for what she could offer or endure, but simply for who she was. One night, while sorting through old files, Linda found a photograph of herself from 10 years ago, standing beside her husband, both of them sunlit and squinting, arms around each other, alive with the comfort of shared years. She traced the edges of the image with her thumb, letting the memory wash over her. There had been love. There had been loss. But there had also been survival. And now there was rebirth. She returned the photo to its envelope, slid it into the drawer, and didn't feel sadness. Just gratitude. Grief, she had come to understand, doesn't vanish. It softens. It becomes part of your breath, your gait, the way you reach for things. But it no longer defines the edges of your life. It simply walks beside you. The next morning, she caught her reflection in the mirror before heading out. Her silver hair was pulled back with a soft clip, her blouse light and breezy. She looked rested. Not young, not old, just sure. She smiled, not for anyone else, but for the woman she had become, the one who had learned to speak softly but stand firmly, the one who had chosen to be her own anchor. And as she stepped out the door into the warm breeze of a life entirely hers, she didn't feel like she was beginning again. She felt like she had arrived. August swept in with a quiet hush, the kind that made Linda feel like the world was briefly exhaling. The days felt slower, not from laziness, but from contentment. The sun no longer scorched but lingered warmly across her skin during morning walks, as if blessing each step she took. Her apartment had grown into a sanctuary. Plants thrived by the windows, books piled neatly on tables, and the small kitchen smelled often of cinnamon or thyme, depending on the day. It no longer felt temporary. It felt like home. She began volunteering once a week at the legal aid office, not as a client, but as a guide, someone who could listen, gently affirm, and share what she had learned. Amelia had been the one to suggest it. "You don't have to relive your story," she said. "Just be present for someone who's still lost in theirs." Linda accepted without hesitation. She knew now how much difference one steady voice could make in the middle of someone else's unraveling. Sitting across from women, some younger, some her age, she heard variations of the same narrative. Control disguised as concern, financial dependency masked as support, isolation passed off as safety. Linda never offered solutions outright. She simply asked, "What do you want to do next?" and let the answers surface slowly. It wasn't her job to rescue anyone. It was her purpose now to remind them they weren't alone. At the end of one long Thursday, she stayed behind in the quiet office, helping Amelia sort through paperwork. "You've become a part of this place," Amelia said with a smile, pushing a stack of files toward her. Linda smiled back, the kind of smile that didn't falter. "I'm not here to fix the system," she replied, "but I can help someone not fall through it." Meanwhile, her relationship with Ernest deepened in gentle increments. They met for coffee most weeks and once shared a day trip to a nearby lake where they spent hours watching birds and talking about nothing that needed resolving. There was no need for declarations, no rush to label what was quietly forming between them. It was enough to sit beside someone who saw her not as someone's mother or someone's widow, but simply as Linda. That weekend, she wrote a new journal entry that felt less like reflection and more like celebration. "I have found myself again," she began, "not where I left me, but somewhere entirely new. I am not a version of the woman I was. I am someone rebuilt with intention." And on a lazy Sunday morning, as she brewed her coffee and looked out at the sky, endless and softly lit, Linda felt no longing for what once was. She had been through the fire and chosen not to become ash, but to reshape her life with deliberate care. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was flourishing, quietly, steadily, fully. And that, she now understood, was her victory. September arrived like a whisper, gentle rains, cool evenings, and early shadows curling along sidewalks. Linda found herself waking to the soft patter of water against her window, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders as she padded across the wooden floor. Mornings like this felt sacred now, the kind that allowed space for reflection, stillness, and tea steeped just a bit longer. She had never known how peaceful silence could be until it was her own to hold. At the Legal Aid Center, Linda noticed the changing faces of those who came in, some anxious, some bitter, others numb. She welcomed them all with the same measured grace, offering a chair, a cup of tea, and a place to breathe. One woman, Marisol, reminded Linda of herself 6 months ago, tired, polite, apologizing for needing help. Linda didn't push, she just listened. And when Marisol finally looked up and whispered, "I didn't think it was abuse," Linda nodded slowly and said, "That's how it works. Until you name it, it hides in kindness." These conversations weren't easy. They never would be. But Linda had stopped fearing discomfort. She had lived through it, wrapped it around herself like armor, and now wore it like a loose skin she no longer needed to explain. When she walked home in the evenings, her pace was slow, but not from weariness. It was presence. She noticed things: the chipped paint on a neighbor's windowsill, the changing leaves on the elm by the corner cafe, the warmth of light spilling under front doors. One Saturday, Ernest surprised her with a visit. He brought scones from her favorite bakery and a new book of poems. They sat on the balcony, their knees almost touching, speaking in soft tones and shared smiles. At one point, as she poured the tea, he asked, "Do you ever wish things had happened differently?" Linda considered this for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I wish I had left sooner, but if I had, I might not have learned how deeply I could trust myself." Ernest didn't press. He just nodded, and that silence was one of the kindest things anyone had ever given her. After he left, Linda stayed out on the balcony, watching the streetlights flicker on. She wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not apology, not redemption, not even closure. She had already written the ending she needed. It didn't come with drama or confrontation. It came in the form of routine, community, and the slow, powerful act of reclaiming her narrative. Inside, she'd had turned on her small radio and let a jazz station fill the space. She moved through her apartment with ease, brushing her hand along the back of her chair, tidying a blanket, straightening a frame. These were small movements, but they belonged wholly to her. As she turned off the lights, the hallway glowed faintly, and from beneath her door came a thin sliver of gold, proof that even in the quiet, even after all she had been through, there was still light waiting on the other side. October's arrival marked the first time in years Linda had looked forward to her birthday. She didn't plan anything elaborate, just a quiet brunch with a few women from the garden, a call with Amelia, and a walk to the bookstore afterward. But this year, she felt something different threading through her, an unshakable sense of ownership over her own joy. There was no guilt, no second guessing, no performance, just a woman marking her years, not by what she'd lost, but by what she'd reclaimed. That morning she found a small card slid beneath her door. It was from Carla, written in violet ink. "You taught me that choosing peace isn't the same as avoiding conflict. Thank you for showing me what power can look like when it's quiet." Linda read the words twice, pressing her fingers gently against the paper, then placed it on her bookshelf beside her journal. It was not validation she needed, but it moved her all the same. Proof that the ripples of her healing had reached others. She made her way to the brunch with a spring in her step, wearing a soft blue scarf and earrings she hadn't worn since her husband passed. The women greeted her with hugs, laughter, and a seat at the sunniest part of the table. Over coffee and pastries, they talked about everything from composting to childhood dreams. When someone asked Linda how she was celebrating this new year of her life, she smiled thoughtfully and said, "By living every day in my name." Afterward, she walked alone to her favorite bookstore, running her fingers along the spines of novels and collections of essays. She bought a slim anthology on personal essays by older women and tucked it into her tote. Outside, the breeze was sharp with the scent of leaves and distant chimney smoke. She took the long way home, crossing through the park, where children shouted from swings and the trees tossed shadows across the path like confetti. At home, Linda lit a candle and opened the book, but found herself setting it down after a few pages. She looked around at her space, no longer temporary, no longer borrowed. The couch, the rug, The chipped mug she loved, every piece had been chosen, not inherited or assigned. She ran a hand across the kitchen counter, appreciating the smoothness, the steadiness. Everything here was hers, and more than that, it reflected her. That evening she sat down to write in her journal, not a reflection this time, but a declaration. "This is my life," she wrote, "not what I was given, not what was taken from me. This life is what I built, with what remained." She paused, feeling the truth of that settle into her like warm light. And when she turned out the lights, the dark didn't feel like an ending. It felt like rest, like a soft landing after a long, hard journey. She no longer lived in reaction to what others did. She lived by her own design, quietly, fully, finally free.